Lord, we just pray that you will help us keep always in mind that we look forward to your return and cleaning up the messy world that we live in. And Jesus reigning and ruling in Jerusalem and a perfect kingdom. Help us to keep that hope always in our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today I'm going to ask the question, will 2022 be 2022? The answer is we may. I borrowed that from somebody. I don't remember who. So if you want, anybody out there want to take credit for it, that's fine. I don't have a source for this. I did see it someplace. These are some of the platforms that we're on. Again, we're trying to develop our own app. We're all volunteers around here, so these things just take more time than they should. So just pray that goes forward. We talk each week about the convergence of events, and certainly it seems that we're in a time where things are just happening much, much more quickly. For 10 years now, probably, close to it, I've been using these foreign policy covers. A World Disrupted. There's actually a major news publication this week, I think it was Newsweek or Time, that had the top disruptors in the world right now. I guess that's a good thing now. I mean, because it's a disrupted world, so we might as well recognize the people who are tearing everything apart. And again, this is just sort of the grid that I use: acceleration, convergence, logistics, understanding, knowing that as we get closer to the time, we will, I think, have a clearer picture as how all these things are going to work out. And we have to admit that, at least with regard to the last couple of years, over the last couple of years, none of us really called everything. I mean, we knew times were coming. We knew there was times of disruption coming, but we just didn't know how it was going to happen, and we didn't know how quickly it would happen. I've got some things I want to show you. It is just... did somebody say crazy? Is that a word of knowledge out there? That, yeah, it is crazy. It's insane, the things that I'm seeing going on. Everybody's afraid. But of course, we have the rational, the great green movement in the world, which is so rational. I saw this picture and immediately Snopes went on, oh, this is taken out of context. And I just thought it was kind of humorous. Years ago, I was in Colorado, a few years ago, and I saw a Tesla on the way to church on Sunday morning, and he went by and it had I emit zero was his license plate. And it's like, you don't emit zero, and don't tell me you're doing net carbon output or anything. You're breathing, you're emitting carbon and that type of thing. And, so here's the one thing I noticed when we drove out west was we're out in the middle of Wyoming and Idaho and the really wide open spaces. I mean, it's wide open spaces. But I didn't see many Teslas out there because sometimes Teslas run out of juice. So here's an interesting picture that I saw someplace of a Tesla that ran out of juice. And of course, Snopes immediately jumped on this. This is out of context. This is fake news. This is just not going to happen. Actually, there was somebody who did a study on this about taking a generator like this and charging it. And they found that after 30 minutes of running a gasoline-powered generator hooked up to a Tesla, you would have enough battery to go 4 miles. So now if you think this, but it's not fake, this is something that somebody's actually marketing. I mean, just look it up. Just if you want an extender for your Tesla, you could do this. Get a hitch and you can tow your generator around with you. And you can fill it up at a gas station. Out in Wyoming, in the middle of nowhere, there are gas stations. Wyoming's got gas all over the place. So I just thought that was kind of humorous because it shows the insanity of the green movement that we're all just going to magically switch to electric when there are enormous pressures being put on the grid. They don't want to burn coal. They don't want to burn gas. Do you know that Israel has enough gas to meet all of Israel's needs for hundreds of years? There's even more gas in the Mediterranean, but now the energy minister in Israel has said, nope, no more exploration. We're done exploring for gas. We're going to go to renewables. Now, they do have a lot of sun in Israel and out in the desert and everything, but that's not reliable. I mean, look at what happened to Texas last year. So the whole world's going to do that. The whole world's going to make this shift all at once, and there's not enough rare earth minerals yet, although because that's a carbon-intensive industry is mining rare earth minerals, and then you have to put them on ships to ship them to the place where they're going to be incorporated into batteries. And they just said that the cost of making the shipping cost alone is going to be at least $2.5 trillion. And of course, we have that money. We just haven't printed it yet. So again, back to the theme, the world ahead, 2022. Will 2022 be 2022? Here's a little, this is from the National in the United Arab Emirates about Christmas. You see how they differ from 2019 to 2021, and will 2022 be any different? I keep talking about this variant that's running around out there. Sometimes it could be, reconstituted as this. I still think because of the problems they've had politically with the new variant in the UK, I think this picture, this editorial cartoon from the Times of London about the number 10 Downing Street, 10987, that's a great countdown. And there are lockdowns all over the world, mandates that are coming in. The Supreme Court has taken up the appeal of the Sixth Circuit decision. Here's what happened. The Fifth Circuit had a case in which a whole bunch of employers and other groups, including, I think, Answers in Genesis was one of them, saying that the president didn't have the authority under OSHA to put in place a mandate for a state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. The lower court and then the Fifth Circuit affirmed it, saying that is way outside the scope of what OSHA allows. So then that was appealed. So they consolidated all the appeals all over the country in front of the Sixth Circuit. An Obama-appointed judge, not surprisingly, said, well, sure, OSHA can do this. This is a dangerous substance. And it's not a dangerous substance because it's a naturally, well, I don't know. I don't think it's naturally occurring, but whatever, Charlie Vector 019er, they said they can regulate in the workplace for employers over 100. So if you work at a place where there's 99, I guess too bad for you, right? We can't protect you, the government. It's just, the whole thing is insane. And you see, I'm going to rename her. I've called her Jen Zuckerberger, but I think her name should be reconstituted to be Cruella von Zuckerberger. So somebody make up a graphic for that and I'll put it up as long as it's, not too bad. But so what we see is this incredible fear being put in everybody all over the place. It's unbelievable. And so here in Canada, or up in Canada, the report came out from their Department of Health that they secretly tracked 33 million phones during the COVID-19 lockdown. To which I'm sure the baby Trudeau will say, well, we need a great reset. But we need to reset the truth on this because we didn't track everybody. There are 38 million people in Canada. So if you assume everybody has a couple, they got over half of them probably. And there's company phones and that type of thing. But they're tracking people, and that's a report that the Canadian government has admitted to it. Just like the Canadian government, you remember the controversy? It seems like it happened, I don't know if it was this year or late last year. They put out a request for proposal where they would allow people, they wanted people to bid on setting up quarantine camps. And immediately everybody said, that's just a conspiracy theory, it's not true. But they did it, and they've rolled them out in smaller countries like Canada, Australia, and other places. And the interesting thing is now, just a few weeks ago, everybody was talking about Australia. What's going on in Australia and the oppression and tyranny there with these psychotic lunatics that are in charge, like Dan Andrews, just a crazy man. I saw a video of him talk about what a great job he's doing, crushing small businesses and everything. The Prime Minister, Scotty Morrison, there's just a lot of issues with these people. It's just interesting, though, that now all of a sudden you don't hear about Australia at all. You don't hear about New Zealand. The ministry that Chuck Missler started, Koinonia House, when I first met Chuck, they were in California. And then Chuck was concerned, this is back in the 2000s, the direction that California was going, so he relocated the ministry to Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And then he was concerned with the direction the United States was going, so he relocated to New Zealand. Well, New Zealand's really over the edge on this. They have that Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern who says, if you need truth, I will be your source of truth. It's sort of like I don't even think George Orwell, if he came back today, would say, well, boy, this is worse than I thought, because it's happening. Well, now Koinonia House is relocating back to Idaho because of what's going on in New Zealand. And the question becomes eventually is, where can you go? Because this is happening everywhere, and we'll see this. And there's this constant fear being put in everybody about everything. And so here's an article, front page of the Los Angeles Times. Frustration builds as unvaccinated fill ICUs. Now, I question those conclusions because there's data from a lot of places that does not support that. But that's the narrative. And remember, so this is kind of a little bit of a review of what happened in 2021. And remember, in the middle of the year, that came out about these people spreading misinformation about the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. And people you couldn't believe, people you had to believe. And then they came out with, they took the pictures and everything from the Islamic terrorism reports that had come out in 2019 in the United States, and then they transferred them over to people who spread misinformation on Facebook and Twitter, et cetera, that they're the same thing. And there's this narrative. By the way, I heard an interview the other day with a gentleman who was arrested as a result of the events of January 6th. He's been in prison for almost a year now, no bail, awaiting trial. From January until July, they were in very much solitary confinement, out of their cell for maybe 1 or 2 hours a day. If you want to hear what he said, go to Dennis Prager. I think first hour, I think, interviewed him on Wednesday or Thursday. It's just, I don't want leftists to be treated like this. They're not even convicted yet. It's terrible what our government is doing to people. But anyway, and see, this is what they're doing too with headlines like this, is they're trying to create this division and tension in society. I think they're being successful. It was supposed to be played in just a moment, but so in light of this, though, you have these stories that come out from the Times of London and everything that they're optimistic about how to deal with the current variant of Charlie Vector 019er, that maybe it's not that bad. You have these questions are asked. This is United Arab Emirates. Will coronavirus booster shots be needed forever? In the picture, look at the picture. I think it's taken in a train station in the Netherlands of people waiting to get their state-approved treatment, additional state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. And because of this, everybody's lining up for tests. You can't get tests. The whole thing is just, it's a world of chaos. Here is, and so here's another headline from the National in the United Arab Emirates yesterday or today about, these are people lined up to get tested. Which kind of begs the question is, nobody's social distanced in that line, if that's what's supposed to protect you. And it's just, why do you need, and if you've taken the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er, why does it only work if somebody else has also received that treatment? You understand what I'm saying? Your treatment is only valid if somebody else has been treated. And what they've done is they've just absolutely crushed resistance, people who are concerned about it, people who want to determine their own treatment. There are staffing shortages. There was a report in the New York Times this morning about Ohio is the worst place in the country and the world for the spread of this. In South Africa, where it's coming, where it supposedly originated, is like, what are you guys all that upset about? And they have a state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er of 20% in South Africa, and they're way ahead of the other countries, but there's not this spread. It's just, and so it becomes to this point where you don't know who or what you can believe. And so I think this came from, I don't know, it was an Arab newspaper about, how we're going to treat the COVID, the Charlie Vector 019er. We're going to beat it to death, I guess. So I'm going to turn down the sound on this because I don't want to, there's bad words. This is a flight yesterday from Atlanta to Tampa, a Delta flight. And there's a flight attendant confronting a man who'd been eating that he needed to pull his mask up. And there's a lot of bad language going back and forth. And he called her the B word. Here you'll see shortly. And she's standing there with no mask, telling him to put his mask up. And he's resisting it a little bit. And the other flight attendants don't like, and now she hits him. And then she spit in his face. Now, I'm not a big advocate of firing everybody for doing it, but she needs to be fired. Yeah. I mean, now, never again. This is inappropriate. And what you'll see is, eventually a couple passengers get up and they come up and they help take the flight attendant to the back of the plane. I thought this guy handled himself pretty well. So here you'll see a couple guys get up in a moment, and I know. Listen, it's a stressful job. I will admit that. I've flown millions of miles in my life, and I can tell you that, one time I was putting something in the overhead bin on a flight from Dallas down to San Antonio. I was like the only one. I was the first one on the plane because I had, Uber frequent flyer status. And I was putting my suitcase in the upper bin, sitting in the aisle seat because I wanted extra leg room. And the flight, she just teed off on me, and I'm like, I don't know what happened. I mean, she was having a bad day. And it happens, okay? But listen, this is inappropriate. But the interesting thing is when you go to the video, you can find it on Twitter, and you read the comments, 70% of the comments are, this guy should have got off the plane. He should drive. Yet we're going to sit in a cramped little closed cabin. The whole thing is just absolutely insane. And here's a report that I found this when I was looking at the Spectator. The slope we are on now may be more slippery than we like to admit. Listen to what the Spectator Australia says. A dangerous tone has crept into the medical discourse. Over the last year, it has become increasingly common to encounter medical professionals talking with apparent glee when they hear of someone getting unwell if they feel that person made the wrong decision. This change in attitude can only happen when we start seeing healthcare decisions as moral ones rather than factual ones, and as group decisions instead of personal decisions. This is groupthink, 1984 groupthink. Rather than asking ourselves how we weigh up the consequences of various policies and treatments, we are implored to project a consensus morality onto such questions. Those of us who dissent are not just wrong, we are heretics. Most directly, this manifests itself as a condescension towards patients. Those who question medical decrees are belittled and insulted both to their face and behind their backs. Although our profession has always been guilty of this conceit to agree, this is written by a doctor, as is common between experts and non-experts, it is a tendency of which we should be wary. This habit cannot be good for those of us who claim our work is fundamentally moral. However, what is a new current of disgust towards people who may disagree with a However, what is new is a current of disgust toward people who may disagree with a medical opinion. Of all sentiments, disgust is particularly dangerous and swiftly leads to an escalating chasm between clinician and patient, between airline passenger and flight attendant. It is this chasm which stops us functioning as effective clinicians and prevents us from reflecting on ourselves. Indeed, this has gone further in many cases. And you see, and as I said in the comments under that flight attendant video, it was just absolutely incredible. About how the people were saying they were putting in, videos of somebody beating somebody else up. That's what should have been done to the guy. And this is not good for society. But look, there's a bigger theological question here too, is that I understand that unregenerate people will always be capable of these things. And that the only way to really rectify this is a massive revival and a people accepting Jesus Christ as their Savior and understanding that they need Him. But after that, so this article concludes in The Spectator, key to medicine is respect for the individual and the relationship between a specific doctor and a specific patient. Without it, we see how contempt flourishes and doctors do unethical things. The current trend in our attitudes towards patients should disturb doctors and patients alike. And isn't this what we learned about science, by the way? That science is based on controversy and disagreement. Except now, the Lord Fauci will determine what is science. I am science, he says, with great confidence. There was a group of doctors, there's 1 million signatures on their declaration that they've come out with. I won't name it because it'll probably get flagged, but you can find it. But they came out and said, we need to talk about early treatment. And now it's okay because the big pharma have come out with some early treatment, so now it's okay to talk about it. in addition to the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. And I received emails and stories from people who've just been distressed at how their spouse or other loved one has been treated when they're hospitalized with problems. It's shocking. The level, and exactly what this article says in the American Spectator, a dangerous tone. Now, so I know the censors will be watching this, but this is the New York Times, quoting from the New York Times, Friday, December 24th, 2021. Now, you don't get more mainstream narrative than the New York Times. And remember back when I spoke at the law school, Liberty Law School back in October, I talked about the great narrative because there's all this thing, they got to create a narrative. All of those of you who disagree, you're deplorables and you're not worthy. And what happens with that? It's shocking. So, there's the Omicron variant and they have all these charts and it's spreading. I'm fairly confident that everybody's going to get this thing. But they also say, well, the studies show it's not that bad, but we got to shut everything down. So the NHL has canceled all their games till, I think, after the first year. They're not letting their players go to the Winter Olympics in China. But I want you to see this article here in the upper middle. You don't need to zoom in, Brian. I'm going to put it up here. Israelis at risk might receive a fourth dose. So Israel's been way out ahead on the vaccinations, and they've been using Pfizer almost, I think, exclusively. And so now they're having a controversy in Israel about, do we give them the fourth dose? So look at what this says, though. Israel is considering whether to approve a fourth COVID-19 vaccine dose. I'm quoting from the New York Times. I actually like the New York Times because I always like to know what the enemy is doing. And it's great that they publish. And I pay for this nonsense, and they usually will tell you a little bit of truth. You just have to dig down through the article. You have to learn how to read. It's usually down the editorializing part, then factual part, then more editorializing. That's usually how they organize their articles. So they have a panel of experts in Israel. Are we going to give people a fourth dose? So they've had a third dose and now a fourth dose. If you can scroll down just a little bit towards the bottom so I can read that. Thank you. The panel of experts advising the Israeli government on the pandemic recognized that uncertainty, but on Tuesday it recommended giving a fourth dose, concluding that the potential benefits outweighed the risk. It pointed to signs of waning immunity a few months after the third shot and said that any delay in additional doses might prove too late to protect those most at risk. But some scientists warned that the plan could backfire because too many shots might cause a sort of immune system fatigue, compromising the body's ability to fight the coronavirus. A few members of the government's advisory panel raised that concern with respect to the elderly, according to a written summary of the discussion obtained by the New York Times. So look, kudos to the New York Times for reporting on the discussion that's taking place in Israel. Now, they've done a limited approval of a fourth booster or fourth state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er. But it's interesting, this is what a lot of people have expressed concerns about, is that we are giving these things over and over again, and it may have long-lasting consequences, which is one of the objections that has been made heretofore, is that there aren't really any long-term studies like a couple, 3 years out. So, and someday I will promise I'm going to put on Rumble a little bit more frank discussion about this. And you have to decide what you're going to do. And here's China, at the Olympics coming up. They've locked down a city of 13 million because they found some cases. Now, It's a totalitarian society, and they can do that. There was a statue, by the way, that memorialized people who had been killed in the protests at Tiananmen Square 30-some years ago. That was removed from where it was standing in Hong Kong this week, because they're doing this, and they're trying to protect the Olympics. They have an investment in the Olympics. And at this point with the Olympics, I just don't care about it. I used to like to watch that stuff, but I don't. I don't really care. I hope nobody goes. And China should pay for what they caused. Good article in the New York Times the other day, what broke the supply chain? And there's a whole bunch of reasons for this, but it's still broken. It sort of started a little bit when that Evergreen container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal for a week or two. But now there's ships just sitting there off the coast of the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And I hear there's like 100 ships, these giant container ships waiting. So that's a trend that's happened this year. And the other thing is this transgender thing in LGBT. This continues to be an issue, and it will continue to be an issue into 2022. The French Parliament, as well as other countries, I think Canada has done this as well, have banned conversion therapy. That is where someone who claims to be LGB, and they go through a process of counseling and that type of thing to not be LGB. They want to become binary. And it might be conversion therapy. It might be because they've believed that verse in Corinthians that says, such were some of you, but now you are transformed by the power of God. And as Christians, we believe that that's possible if somebody is willing. The interesting thing, though, is they say it's LGBT conversion therapy. It's not. Okay, well, maybe it is. But so having somebody go through counseling to psychologically change their mind, that's bad. That's evil. But hormone suppressant therapy for, hormone suppressant therapy for someone who wants to become a female or vice versa, and then cutting off body parts, that's okay. We celebrate that. This is insanity. And people are speaking out, non-Christians. I played the clip of the feminists last week from Tucker Carlson who said, conversion therapy or transgender identity. These words have no meaning. It's fake. And so someone like a billionaire authoress like J.K. Rowling, whose great offense 3 years ago was that someone had put up a tweet criticizing this train of thought, that transgender women who are really biological men can menstruate and have babies. That's what they say. I mean, it's true. And so somebody was criticizing that train of thought, and J.K. Rowling liked the tweet. For 3 years now, she has been attacked. She has received death threats, rape threats, because she's saying, I believe that women are women and men are men. And I'm a feminist, and I don't like that men are now intruding on women's spaces. It's happening in prison and that type of thing. And so all of the stars of the Harry Potter movies, and J.K. Rowling has made, I've heard she's worth several $1 billion. I mean, it's probably the most popular thing. But and the people who protest this or protest her, say, look, she's only talking about a very small, teeny tiny minority of people. But then you get a large group of people like this protesting her, carrying signs, J.K. Rowling, rot in hell. No pride for some without liberation for all. Protect trans rights. Rot in hell, Rowling. Well, that's really elevated the discourse, hasn't it? And she also supported Myra Forrester, I believe her name was, who had also said this and got fired from her job. And by the way, who's won appeals. The courts have said this is nonsense. You can't fire somebody for having an opinion like this. But that doesn't stop the young woke stars like Emma Watson and whatever Radcliffe, whatever his name is, who starred in the Harry Potter movies. And they're saying, you know, we ought to go Lord Voldemort on her. I don't know that much about Harry Potter, only what I've never read the thing, I don't like it. But the language has become very bad. So this is something that ought to concern you. This is a report, and I may have talked about this before, but it's always interesting. Somebody will send me, I'll do my update, and then somebody will send me something like, you got to look at this, you got to look at this. Oh yeah, like Prince Charles' talk at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, where he talked about, with trillions at his disposal. What did he mean by that? And so somebody put up a video this week about it, and they said, you got to watch this. Look at what Prince Charles said. And I'm like, yeah, I talked about that like on November 6th in my update. But that's okay, because sometimes people will say, it's not like I remember. I have to go check to make sure I talked about it. But so I don't even remember everything that I talk about, so I can't expect everybody to remember. But usually I do cover these things. And I don't want to say that I'm the only source of authority or anything like that. But listen, this is important. This is from the Aspen. That's kind of an interesting Freudian slip there. Apsen Institute. Apps is a poisonous snake. Wasn't that in the Indiana Jones movie? The Aspen Institute, which is a humanist organization. They have a security conference every year, foreign policy conference. So they put together a whole big commission to talk about commission on information disorder. So now, it's not misinformation. It's now a psychological disorder. Now, they never identify what the truth is, because I guess the truth is sort of like what one of the justices on the Supreme Court said about obscenity. I know misinformation when I see it. He said, I know obscenity when I see it. And so here's some of the people on the commission. Prince Harry. Boy, he's a great intellectual giant. In fact, when he was interviewed recently, he said, I don't get this First Amendment thing. It's bonkers, this First Amendment thing, he said. Which means that he doesn't get it. Up here, if you look up here in the upper right-hand corner of that page, Katie Couric, the great example of journalism, who goes back and edits out things in her interviews so she doesn't get by. And over here on the right is a guy named Rashad Robinson. He's the president of Color of Change. And he has a number of quotes. For example, here's some quotes from this report. Information disorder is a crisis that exacerbates all other crises. When bad information becomes as prevalent, persuasive, and persistent as good information, it creates a chain reaction of harm. It isn't like a nuclear reaction thing. Once it starts, it just explodes, I guess. Currently, the U.S. lacks any strategic approach and clear leadership in either the public or the private sector to address information disorder. The federal government has been ill-equipped and outpaced by new technologies and the information ecosystems that take shape around them. There's a reason why the federal government should not have something in place to deal with this. Why? It is called Aspen Institute. You may not be familiar with this. You can get a copy. Email me, I'll get you a copy. It's called the United States Constitution. And that United States Constitution is not Prince Harry. It's not bonkers. By the way, you are, my friend. I mean, look, you got a great house, great life out there in California. Have fun. Enjoy it as you watch it burn down around you. But the First Amendment to the Constitution says Congress, and this has been applied to the states, shall make no law respecting speech or the free exercise thereof. You're not allowed to do it. So what is our government doing right now? And this started under the Obama administration. They did this with conservative 501c4s and other organizations that were set up to promote certain political speeches, which is more protected than just like anything else in the world under our Constitution. They had the IRS attacking these. And now they figured out, well, we don't need to do this. Just they're following the European model. In Europe, what they did was they said, we got to stop hate speech. So Facebook, Twitter, all you companies, you stop hate speech. If we identify it, you got to take it down within 24 hours. You get fined big numbers. So what they did was they outsourced the control of speech. Now, this is prohibited under the Constitution. So that's why it's not done. So they have recommendations to build trust. Here's one of them: comprehensive federal approach. It's not allowed. Establish a comprehensive strategic approach to countering disinformation and the spread of misinformation, including centralized national response strategy, clearly defined roles and responsibilities across the executive branch, and identified gaps in authorities and capabilities. Now, this is made up of people that are associated with government, influential in government, and if I didn't know better, I would say a coup has happened. And I put up an interview of someone who said that that's exactly what happened. They've attacked the First Amendment. They've closed places of worship, but they let bars open. And it's okay to let the bars open, but they're not in the First Amendment. Churches are. Now, there is some good news here. The judge, this is about the Project Veritas raid that was done, and they took their phones, and information included protected attorney-client information, which is still a right under our laws and constitutions and government laws. What they did was the judge has said, New York Times, you have these memos, you have to give them back and stop publishing about them. And this is an article from the New York Times, by the way. And then we have this is kind of going to be a constant thing about transhumanism, and here's the thing with metaverse weddings, some unreal possibilities. Well, first of all, a metaverse wedding is unreal by definition. But if you do get married in the metaverse and you need to get divorced or separated, I might be willing to do it, but only for real dollars or Bitcoin, okay? And they've actually had the first case of people wearing virtual reality headsets that are meeting in a room, and one lady claims she was groped in virtual reality. And these are people who may actually grow up, if the Lord tarries, to run things. You understand? This is what's really frightening. So here's a growth thing: global transhumanism growth opportunities. This is a prospectus that's put out. Transformational growth in biological health and wellness augmentation will enable the rise of human 2.0. Radical changes in science and technology are helping the body evolve. Biological augmentations and body enhancements are transforming the human body and bringing about a kind of transhumanism by eliminating diseases, extending lifespans, and enhancing human capabilities. And this is all okay. And it says they're broken down into three main categories: internal implants, external wearables, and aesthetic augmentations. Speaking of aesthetic augmentations, I mean, you see the pictures of these beautiful women in Hollywood that have had augmentation. And it's tragic. It's horrible what they've done to themselves. I mean, so much for aging gracefully. It's awful what happens to some people. And I know the pressure out there. But if they're not successful with the external stuff, should humanity be playing around so much in this other stuff? And I say this as a guy who has 4 artificial joints. So, that helps. That changed my life. I could walk again. Couldn't run, but that I considered that a benefit. I never liked running anyway. It's just, you got all sweaty and hot and your feet hurt and all that stuff. But this study explores the technologies and trends that will enable human body to evolve and examines the changes in diet and exercise habits that will accompany the transformation. So the Klaus Schwab statement, you'll own nothing. Well, it's not Klaus Schwab's statement, but it's on the World Economic Forum website, an article, you'll own nothing and be happy. Okay, you won't be able to eat meat again and you'll be happy, because we're going to tell you you're going to be happy. And if you're not, we have a little pill that you can take that will help you along there if you mistake that badly. It also identifies the growth opportunities these enhancements will bring about for different stakeholders in the transhumanism segment. And so here's Elon Musk, the person of the year. And by the way, he's not person of the year because he has a Tesla. I think person of the year is the guy who comes up with the towable battery extender. That guy should make $1 zillion too. Except now they're going to say, well, that has to be powered by electric also. So you're going to see these big semis of batteries, being towed behind a Tesla going down the street so it can drive across Wyoming, I guess, or Wyoming and South Dakota in the same day. This is an article from Haaretz Friday. DNA cut and paste, editing humanity's future. A decade after CRISPR discovery, the unimaginable outcomes of gene editing emerge. And I hope you understand that what we're trying to do is we're trying to paint a picture of there are these different themes in Bible prophecy, and this transhumanism, technocracy, artificial intelligence all plays into the logistics of how eventually this is going to play out. Now, whether we're at that exact endpoint yet, I can't say. I'm not a date setter. I don't like date setters. But it seems to me that we're getting awfully close, because we're at really the Tower of Babel on steroids now, because they was trying to make people into God. And that's the whole thing behind transhumanism and artificial intelligence and that type of thing. So efforts to alter the DNA of animals have achieved their goal in many cases, this article says, but have also produced quite a few surprises. In one case, researchers in China tried to reduce fat in rabbits. That's a laudable goal, because you see rabbits dropping dead all the time, right? From heart attacks. Well, maybe they had a heart attack after the car hit them. And along the way, this is what they found in China, it caused the animals' tongues to become exceptionally long. To cure AIDS, blindness, and simple urinary tract infections, to pave the way for transplanting pig organs in humans, and even to augment the population of female egg-laying chicks. In 2012, when 2 researchers discovered gene discovered a mechanism that enables gene editing. Many thought it would be a game changer in the realm of science. A decade later and two Nobel Prizes later, it's clear that prediction was accurate. But again, it's not perfect. But human beings are trying to play God. And I think eventually God comes in and says, nope, I've had enough. I told you guys what you could do. This is God stuff. You're not God. You may think you are, but I'm going to now prove to you with the power of my word, Jesus will say, who I am. And it's interesting. This is the time of year we talk about the birth of Jesus. I saw a great interview with Sean McDowell earlier this year, interviewing Joel Kramer, the archaeologist, a friend of mine, who took us around Israel 4 years ago. I highly recommend it. Get the book Where God Came Down. Buy it as a Christmas present for yourself if you have to. Buy it for somebody else. It's an excellent book. And Joel was being interviewed by Sean, and Joel made a very good point. In Israel, nobody questions the historicity of Jesus. It's not done. They believe he was real. Nobody questions that where he was born was in a cave under the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, or that he was from Nazareth. They just don't question it over there. It's in the West where we don't have the stones and rocks and everything staring us in the face. It's a fascinating interview. And maybe someday I'll do an interview. I've talked to Joel about doing an interview, and I'll get around to it. Buy that book. It will affirm your faith. It will help you understand what's going on with archaeology and why certain sites are important and some are not, because they have a historicity attached to them. It was clear that this place in Bethlehem, that's now got this Church of Nativity over it, was an important site long before there was a church there. There's a reason why the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and listen, I've been to Israel a number of times, and I love the Garden Tomb. It's pastoral, it's pleasant, the birds are chirping, you have communion there, it's respectful, it's quiet, but I don't think it's the place. Good people running it, they love the Lord, they love Jesus, they share the gospel, they talk about the resurrection, earth-changing, world-changing, eternity-changing event. But I think Joel's correct. It happened over at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because there was a Roman statue there. They put that up over when they tore down where pilgrims went and that type of thing, because they wanted to obliterate the foundations of Christianity. But you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. How many of you have been there? It's not a very pleasant experience, is it? It's kind of messy. This church, the priests, they run different parts of it. They get in fistfights and that type of, it's not the experience that the Garden Tomb is, but I think this is the place where Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. But now we're in this age, so we have the historicity of Jesus. It's an established fact, but here in America, a lot of churches, they sort of talk like, yeah, we kind of believe in this. We don't really believe in the Trinity, but, maybe Jesus is God. But then you have pastors like Stephen Furtick who say, I am God. I have to get the clip and play this. This is just troubling. But the question of existence comes up. And so here is this $10 billion space telescope lift off on a voyage to witness the birth of the universe. Now, I kind of hold my breath when they do this because I want them to be successful. I think these pictures of the universe are really cool. And this is going to go out beyond the moon. And this picture of it on Haaretz, next to an article that the Attorney General has now put in place things in Israel, paving the way to sanctions on the unvaccinated. That's Israel. So here's this thing. This is a video of the of the thing being released into space off of the rocket, the booster. And it's going out there, and it appears everything's been going well, and everybody's excited because, if it doesn't work, $10 billion is a little bit of a problem to take care of. And this thing is the most powerful telescope ever made. It's going to be out there where there's no atmosphere to deal with. It will be interesting. But one of the things they want to do is they want to do two things. They want to look back to the beginning of the universe. I read a book about it. I know how it started. God said. Amen. And the other thing, though, is they want to search for other worlds where there will be life. Now, there's a theological problem, but NASA has actually gone out through a center. I can't remember the name of this. It's a center at Princeton University, the James Webb Space Telescope. And they've actually contracted with a Princeton think tank or Center for Theological Studies or something to get 24 theologians prepared to talk about what do we do if we find life elsewhere, intelligent life elsewhere. Now listen, this does seem to play into a lot of people's end time scenarios. This is happening right now, today. They put this commission together. NASA put together a religious commission to deal with this. Sometimes I think I'm accused of making this stuff up. So so now let's talk about Middle East, and we'll finish up with this. Did somebody change? Did the time change? My clock looks like it's moving along pretty quickly. So, by the way, McDonald's has the new Choco Fudge Latte. This is the times of the UK, so I don't know if that's available in the United States or not. But anyway. So here's a Saudi ambassador to the UN being interviewed, talking about, we have this whole thing about the Abraham Accords. So Trump put in the Abraham Accords in the latter part of his administration. I'm not a fan of it. I understand peace, but my concern is who's all involved in it and the chance for treachery. And if you look at his Psalm 83, you sort of get an idea about that concern. Go read that passage and know that the countries they're trying to bring into this Abraham Accords are the 10 nations that are come out of what's identified there in Psalm 83. And there's this economic component. And we know that when we go over to Revelation 13, and this beast puts in a system by which people are going to buy and sell, that is what? That's an economic system. So when I see these things with this huge emphasis on the economic aspect, it concerns me. It concerned me about the Trump plan, because whether it was going to be accepted or not, it proposed a two-state solution. The other thing that was pretty apparent, or should have been a concern then, was that how do you know Trump's going to be in office forever to sort of enforce this? But it proposed a two-state solution. You cannot deny that. And so it was concerning. So now the question is Saudi Arabia going to come in? So there's two power centers in Saudi Arabia. There's King Salman, who is frail health, and then there is his mid to late 30s son, Mohammed bin Salman, who is now the crown prince. There were other crown princes that Salman had before him, but this one seems to have risen to power. And he's been pretty ruthless in some of the things that he's done. He's very close to Jared Kushner, by the way, who is the architect of the Abraham Accords with Avi Berkowitz. And you should read the interviews about what they've said. And there's a document out there, I'll try to put up a copy of it. That's the Abraham Accord Peace Institute. That's AAPI. That's the organization that Jared Kushner put together to advance the Abraham Accord Peace Initiative. And he's running around, and in the document it says they're going to raise money. And Jared Kushner has been out there raising money for an investment fund, and it was reported this week that he's raised $3 billion. So at the same time that this is going on, so here's what, though, that everybody says, well, Saudi Arabia will come in. Now, the king is still in control, and this is what his representative says. And I don't have that. Okay, well, what he said was, listen, it's a two-state solution, and it has to be done along the lines of the Abraham Peace Accord, of the Arab Peace Initiative of 2001, that Crown Prince Abdullah at the time came in, and they had a big Arab meeting about it. Now, it's interesting that Arab Peace Initiative came after, remember Prime Minister Sharon when he went up on the Temple Mount? How dare a Jew go up on the Temple Mount? That led to the Second Intifada, which sort of, this was in 2000. September 28, 2000, that's the Park Hotel in Netanya. 30 were killed at a Passover celebration by a suicide bomber who came from one of the Arab communities across what is known as the Green Line. That was the start of the Second Intifada when Sharon went up on the Temple Mount. This is pretty much when Israel said, okay, enough. There were over 1,000 Israelis killed in that process. They eventually raided the Jenin refugee camp after this bombing at the hotel in Netanya, and 23 IDF soldiers were killed. This is an article that was in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal last year, September 20th, 2020, talking about Saudi royal family divides over potential embrace of Israel. So people are optimistic when King Salman is out of the way. Mohammed bin Salman, who seems to be a little bit more tolerant of Israel, will change things. But just understand, there's a whole train of thought in Saudi Arabia that he's going to overcome. So remember this, the first Trump foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia. And he was there with King Salman holding, and a Sisi of Egypt holding their hands on this glowing orb, very strange thing going on. The family met with the royal family. Jared Kushner's met with bin Salman. Here's a report from The Hill that Kushner's now raised more than $3 billion for his investment fund. While all this is going on, bin Salman has been going around the Gulf Coast, Arab Gulf Coast countries on visits. He's gone to all of them: Oman, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Qatar also, which is, there's a lot of tension between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But he met, and then they had a big Gulf Coast Council meeting in Riyadh about 2 weeks ago. And they said regional security is on the agenda at the Gulf Coast Council, and they essentially said, listen, an attack on one of us is an attack on all. Naftali Bennett, first time ever a prime minister, went to the United Arab Emirates, hoping for what? Mideast stability and talks with Israel. About 2 weeks, well, no, it was December, I'm trying to remember the date. They had an exercise. Now, we see these exercises all the time. We see Event 201. We see CLAD 18. That was talking about public health crises, and they were wargaming these public health crises and how they might respond to that. And I'll talk more about, I talked about Event 201 near the time that it happened in late 2019. And listen, on the one hand, we expect our public health officials to plan ahead, right? I mean, we expect our military officials to plan ahead. But then again, we also know that sometimes there's a nefarious plan when they're planning ahead. And you can go back to Rockefeller Foundation things, and you can find things about how they were going to treat a public health problem like Charlie Vector 019er, Ventura 1, Clad 18, all sponsored, by the way, the last two by the World Economic Forum, Johns Hopkins Public Health Institute, and the Bill and Melissa Gates Foundation. And so in Israel, on December 9th, they had a war game. It was supposed to be in the United Arab Emirates, but because Omicron had made its appearance, they decided to move it to Jerusalem. Now, this is kind of interesting that they moved it to Jerusalem. So and it says here, Israel leads what? 10 countries simulation of major cyber attack on world markets. And they war gamed a cyber attack on the global financial system. And so you expect people that are involved in banking and finance and government and that type of thing to be preparing for cyber attacks because they're happening all the time. But the question always is, well, how much do they know about what's coming? Or are they going to cause it? Because at this point, it's very hard to trust people in government that have your best interest at heart. So it's just interesting that this took place in Jerusalem. Here's a picture of the people sitting around the table. Participants included members of the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of International Settlements from Basel, Switzerland, the World Bank, Tel Aviv's BEST Crisis Management Company, and Treasury officials from nations of Austria, Germany, Israel, Italy, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, United States. And here's another picture of them sitting around the table. Maskless, it's just... If hypocrisy was water, the world would drown. And this is what the Gulf Coast Council came around the same time and said, attack on any one of us is an attack on all of us. Prime Minister, they've been a big controversy. How are we going to deal with this Omicron? Are we going to put restrictions on the unvaccinated? Even though, there's a team, or there's a U.S. warship, 100% of the sailors on the ship have received the state-approved treatment, all of the state-approved treatments for Charlie Vector 019er. And so they've been out at sea for a while. And now guess what? There's a outbreak. And the ship is stuck and isolated in port. Nobody can get off. And they've quarantined the ones who have it from the ones who don't. But they all had 100%. Crazy. It's just, I don't even know what to say because I'm always afraid that YouTube will take me down, and Facebook. But someday we'll do that thing. So this was an article in the Jewish Chronicle in the UK a couple weeks ago talking about this conflict that seems to be rising up between Israel and Iran. And it talked about how Israel had been very clever in the way that they've undermined the Iranian nuclear program. The problem is that they've not completely shut it down. It's just they do things, and then Iran learns where their weak spots are and takes care of them. And one of the things that happened in that was an attack on Moshe Fazi Kaded, or whatever his name is, the Iranian nuclear scientist, and it was really about the first documented artificial intelligence attack anywhere done by Israel. And people denied it initially, and now they're saying, no, this is really what happened. So Israel does all these things, and so now the question is, there's these negotiations going on in Vienna. Iran has been very recalcitrant about getting back into this JCPOA agreement. And they've become very extreme in the demands that they're making. They've really dialed it up because they want to get to a breakout capacity. And they may not be there yet, but they're developing centrifuges that will get them there in a matter of weeks to a month because the centrifuges process things so much more quickly. So Israel's talking about Iran has all these proxy militias. I'll talk about that in a moment. And this was from Israel Hayom. I mentioned it last week, but only for context, that this is a big concern now of Israel, is this drone army, drone air force that Iran is developing, which is relatively low cost and designed to overwhelm defense systems. And this asymmetrical warfare is a real game changer. And it's mainly coming through drones. At the same time, Hamas is raising its head, being supported by Iran. And this is Ismail Haniyeh, who has said, time has come to settle the historical battle with Zionism. He stressed that the Operation Sword of Al-Quds is Jerusalem, had overtaken plans to normalize relations, and the Oslo Accords dealt a heavy blow to the so-called deal of the century and put the issue of Palestine back on the agenda to the extent that the Security Council of the United Nations, the European Union, and the Arab League have all met for it. And they've all come out in support of this two-state solution. So Alma Research, which is an organization in northern Israel, highly recommend their website. They have great reports, good graphics, understandable. They analyze things that are going on in Lebanon and Syria and how it relates to northern Israel, because this is one of the major fronts of any conflict between Israel and Iran. So the concern is that Israel needs to go, I think everybody agrees, eventually they're going to go attack the Iranian nuclear facilities. The issue is, what is the fallout from that? What's the response of Iran and all of these militias that are embedded in Lebanon, including this one, which is coming to the fore more, which is Hamas militias supported by Iran in Lebanon, particularly some of these down here near Tyre, just north of the Israel-Lebanon border. The U.S. has come out and they've said, look, Iran, if you do anything, we're going to respond robustly. But then the question is, if Israel attacks first, what's Iran going to do? So there has been some concerns expressed. And look, I'm not trying to say I think Israel is doomed or anything, but I'm just saying on a human scale, as Israel gets more and more isolated, even from the United States, who seems to be as concerned, more concerned even about Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria than they are about the Iranian nuclear program, which is just a continuation of the first two Obama administrations, continuing into the third Obama administration, now known as the Biden administration. What happens if Israel goes ahead and attacks Iran? The concern among a large number of IDF people is that these retaliatory responses from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from Hamas in Gaza, and from the militias in Syria and Lebanon that are controlled by Hezbollah and Hamas, that the planes won't even be back to Israel and the attacks will be happening on Israel. And this can have a very disruptive effect. So they've been wargaming this in Israel. They've been doing some war games about civilian responses and that type of thing, but it's not an easy question. And then this was a report from Alba this week. Iran's unmanned aerial vehicle army, drone army, a global threat. And the Cayenne newspaper in Iran says Zionist center, that's Alma, is a Zionist center. Hezbollah has 2,000 drones. And so Alma went through and looked at some of the drone facilities that are located in Syria, some around Damascus, some in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley, and what they're going to do. Here's a report from Press TV. Now, this is Iranian propaganda, but it says, starting from zero in 1987, Hamas can now hit all Israeli-occupied territories, says the senior leader. And there's a little bit of a split, but so here's some things. These are some pictures taken. This is a Iranian drone array. And you can see that they're ready to launch multiple drones. I mean, they attacked the biggest Saudi oil facility and did pretty major damage to it. Here's the launching. Here's the accuracy of what the drone can do. They're usually artificial intelligence controlled. This is the car of Moshe Fakhrizadeh, who was killed a year ago. This is how Iran views the world. Everybody's got their artificial intelligence. Well, this is how they view it. They have all this ability to attack people. They're confident of what they can do. Their economy's falling apart. Their society's falling apart. Young people are leaving the country. People are converting to Christianity, but they're ready to go. And this is what Ayatollah Khomeini said on November 17th, 2021 in a tweet. Artificial intelligence, they're not backward, they're very intelligent. Artificial intelligence will play a role in managing the future of the world. Well, he's on board. Invite him to Davos. He's ready for the Great Reset. This should be seriously taken into consideration. We should be at least among the top 10 countries in the world in this field, and that's their goal. So this week they released some videos of their ability for missile and drone attacks. One was this missile array that they launched. The IRGC chief said Iran will cut off enemies' hands if they make a wrong move. The Tehran Times said stark warning. Kayhan, or whatever, however you say it, talked about these missiles. Here's a video of the missile attack that they put together. This is launched from Iran. And they're showing this because you should understand, everybody, they said that we have the capability, missile range to hit sites in Israel. And that's their goal. So, and this is where that picture came from, this stark warning showing these 16 missiles in flight with their contrails. These are other missile launcher facilities. Some of those were ground-based. These are above ground-based mobile missile launchers. So this is not a backward company. This is a serious threat. This is a global threat according to Alma Research, and I think I agree with Alma Research. Fascinating stuff. Here's another, these are some, they also had ship-based, and this is a simulation of an attack on Dimona, which is the Israeli nuclear facility. And they're going to show what happens. Here's a little bit better video of that. This is supposedly Dimona, and this is what they hope to do with it. Because what's their goal in all of this? Well, I just went and perused through Khomeini's website. I love the fact, I love the internet. Everybody puts everything up on the internet, so it's easy to find out what people are thinking. And so this is the images that I got off of Khomeini's website. What is that? The Dome of the Rock. What is the foundation that supports the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount? Those are all cards. The foundation is the Iranian-supported militias. There's a huge symbolism in this. It's also interesting, if you look at this from a 3D perspective, you see Australia, you see South America, you see Russia up there to the top. What is this picturing? What is this picturing in the Iranian mind, the mind of Ayatollah Khomeini and the people that he controls? That Jerusalem is at the center of the world. Now that has prophetic implications, my friends. That is what the Bible says. That's Zechariah. All nations will be gathered against Israel. And it sits at the confluence of these continents. Here's an old tapestry that's used by people even today. You see Europe, Asia, and Africa, and what's right in the middle? Jerusalem. And so when they say that these militias sponsored by Iran, what they're saying is it will support these militias sponsored by Iran will support the liberation of Jerusalem, which sits at the center of the earth. That's what they believe. Look at some of these other images from the Ayatollah's website. The dove stabbed in the heart by what? A knife with what on it? Israeli flag. Here's Soleimani, a picture of him on the right next to Al-Aqsa Mosque at the southern steps there at the Temple Mount. But look at the picture on the left. Do you see the shadow, what it is? Now this is the Western Wall. Look at what the shadow is. You need to understand this is the mindset that we're dealing with. It's not just a nuclear program. This is what they're thinking. And this is Daniel chapter 10 in the demonic prince behind Persia. Now, not all Persians, not all Iranians, but do you understand how this plays into Bible prophecy? This is from his website. This is a picture. I just did a Google image search on Iranian Dome of the Rock. You see, and one up there in the upper second row on the right, you see the Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution for Iran back in 1979. So do you understand the importance of what all we see going on in the world? It's just not, people being bad negotiators. This is kind of an interesting editorial cartoon that I found. 34. What does that mean? Well, do you remember the article that I showed you? Let's see. I think it was this article. No. Well, there was an article that mentioned 1987. Okay, so let's go 34 years, add 34 to 1987, and you would come up to what? What year? 2021. What year are we in? 2021. So do you understand the symbolism behind this editorial cartoon? 34 years ago, when Hamas, who we support, was founded, we were using slingshots. Now we have missiles. You see that progression in their thought? Now, at the same time this is going on, I'm going to go about another 10 minutes probably. And it's not my fault because it's all these people making this stuff happen all at the same time. So I take no responsibility for this. So The Guardian last week, before last Sunday, had this article, Holy Land Christians Face Persecution. And it was the head of one of the Christian organizations about Christians being persecuted in the Holy Land. Then Justin Welby, who's the head of the Anglican Church from Canterbury, I think is where he's based out of, this guy, by the way, he said that the persecution was coming from extremist Jewish groups. Didn't cite any evidence or anything. And look, there are extremist Jewish groups that do this. Welby, he just said, this is just stuff that is happening. Let us pray for Christians being driven from the Holy Land, but he doesn't talk about the why. He just says, listen, Christians used to be 2% of the population of the Holy Land, and they're being driven out of the Holy Land. Why? Because now they're only 1% of the population. Well, now wait a minute. So when the survey was done, the population was about 73,000. It was 2%. Well, but the population wasn't what the population is now. So now the population of Christians has gone from 73,000 to 184,000, but the percentage that they represent in the Israeli population has gone down. But that doesn't sound to me like they're being driven out. They also have lower birth rates. And usually they're losing them out of the West Bank. It's one of those scare words, like transgender identity. West Bank. Doesn't really mean anything. If you have Fox Nation, go watch Battle for Bethlehem. Brian Schrager, our friend, was in that with Peter Hegseth at Fox Nation. And they tried to interview people in Bethlehem. Title of the program, Battle for Bethlehem. They tried to interview people, Palestinian Arabs in Bethlehem, about what's going on with Christians. And they weren't able to interview a single one of anyone in authority because they knew if they did, they would get mistreated by the authority in charge in Bethlehem, which is not the Israeli government. So this is what Justin Welby said. And this also shows this apostasy in the church that's coming. 2 Timothy 3, 2 Timothy 4, 1 Timothy 4. People are going to launch onto myths. And I want you to understand, Justin Welby is the head of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. By the way, Beth Moore came out this week and announced she had joined an Anglican church in Spring, Texas. If you go look at that Anglican church, in their communion aspect, they believe in transubstantiation, which is exactly what the Roman Catholic Church believes. That's what it says in their statement of faith. And she's okay with it. And that's really, you talk to Mike Gendron and other people and myself, that's one of the most abhorrent doctrines of Roman Catholicism, that we re-sacrifice Jesus over and over again. No, 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 no. Hebrews, he died once, he died for all time. One time. And when he was done, he ascended to the right hand of the Father and sat down because his work was done in terms of redemption. This is an abhorrent doctrine. But this guy's the head of the Church of England. Christmas is a time when we think about the land of the Bible, he writes. We hear readings and sing carols that name Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. These are places that are familiar to billions of Christians, whether they have visited them or not, but we should not romanticize them, and especially not this Christmas. Last week, church leaders in Jerusalem raised an unprecedented and urgent alarm call. In a joint statement, they said that Christians throughout the Holy Land had become the target of frequent and sustained attacks by fringe radical groups. They described countless incidents. And so he has this map of the breakdown. You can see the population of Christians has gone from 2% to 1%, but it's gone up in number. That's why when you hear these things about the genocide of the Palestinian Arabs, there are many times more of them today than there were in 1948. If somebody's doing genocide, they're doing a really lousy job of it. When I grew up, genocide meant, like the country, Cambodia. Was it Cambodia where the Khmer Rouge was? That was genocide. Half the country was killed. Mao did genocide. Over the Advent period, it's tempting to be seduced by cozy visions of the Christmas story, twinkling stars, exotic visitors, the painless birth of a baby who does not cry. Where are you reading that? This is the head of the Church of England writing this nonsense. That was a smelly livestock area. The reality would have been very different. This is a story of God's embrace of humanity and all its messiness. The first Christmas tells us of God coming into our world among ordinary lives of human struggle. In the foreground, and now listen to this guy is woke. This guy is so woke he should never touch coffee again. In the foreground, the head of the Church of England says this. This just shocks me. Well, here's the quote. The first Christmas tells us of God coming into the world among ordinary lives of human struggle, and the foreground is a refugee family against the backdrop of the genocide of infants. He's got the whole story order out of place. I talked about that last Sunday. If you want, go watch my message on Do You Not Know These Things? And I would say, I didn't think I was directing it at Justin Welby, but I would say, Justin Welby, do you not know these things? Have you not read? Do you understand what happens when the rot of this woke theology is layered on top of the church? It just destroys everything. It's like a cancer overtaking sound doctrine. The London Times had this editorial, there's no savior in sight for the Holy Land. And they talk about, man, this guy doesn't have the story right. He says this, for those in the Middle East not ready to make such a compromise, Iran, for example, the message is the polar opposite. The struggle to abolish Zionist entity should never be abandoned, and the fate of Jerusalem is the flag around which the resistance can rally until victory is complete. Settler encroachments and the growing hardline Orthodox presence in Jerusalem, which divide both the Israeli political establishment and its backers in the West, are a welcome first stage of the entity's implosion. I mean, this is talking about how the Arabs view this. And so this editorial says, none of this you will see in the Archbishop of Canterbury's musings or the Archbishop of Canterbury's tales. This dangerous uncertainty is, however, all too palpable in the most important actor, which, despite the talk of declining power, remains the U.S. Talks about the America's security guarantee to the state of Israel. This was also from Arab News. UK condemns Iran's launch of ballistic missiles in the war games that I just showed you the images of. Melanie Phillips has a great takedown of what Justin Welby said. You can go to Melanie Phillips at Substack, at her website, at Christmas Crusades, scapegoating the Jews. Also in the Jewish Chronicle, it's also dealt with this. Fury with Archbishop over blinkered remarks on Christians in the Holy Land. In other words, it's the Jews that are doing this. It's the Jews. It's always the Jews. When we know that the reality is much different. So I would highly recommend Melanie's takedown of this. One more thing. This is an article from INSS, the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies. Whoever flees from maneuver warfare will not win. It's a PDF. It's, 14, 15, maybe 41 pages long. I don't know. But it talks about the fact that Israel does have a problem with this Iranian threat. And what happens is Israel makes the attack on the Iranian facilities, but there's going to be a response. This gentleman who used to be in the IDF says, listen, we've got to be prepared for a ground invasion. Remember the clip I played of you for you a couple of years ago from the Israeli Air Force head at the Nahariya conference, the Netanya conference, I think put on by INSS, one of the think tanks over there. And he said, listen, we're ready to do shock and awe like you've never seen in southern Lebanon. But the problem is it's not just southern Lebanon. It's Syria, it's Iraq, it's Iran. This is a big issue. And so this is, and especially when you have a government in place in the United States that's not going through that. So this article looks at that and says, they come to the conclusion, without a strong ground force that has high quality formations that allow it to be used quickly, even if the full order of battle has not been amassed, and a real willingness to use it almost immediately after the beginning of combat based on original operative plans, Israel will not achieve what it needs in a northern campaign, and the implications for the Israeli home front, Israeli society, and Israeli security could be severe. So there are realist people. Now listen, we know that there's the God factor in all of this. But we also know that there's trouble ahead. There all nations gathered against Jerusalem. We know that this is a fact because it's prophecy that's going to be fulfilled in some way. And then this also from INSS, just released this week, resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the viability of one-state models. And it says this was covered in Haaretz. So you don't like the two-state solution, meet the one-state model. And it goes through and it analyzes in pretty great detail, I think it's almost 100 pages long, the different kind of things. You could have a unitary state, just Israel. With what do we do with Gaza? That's always a problem. We could have a Palestinian autonomy in Gaza and areas of what is known as the West Bank, really Judea and Samaria. Or we could have a confederation where they kind of jointly govern. And this paper concludes that, none of these really work very well. The two-state solution is about all you can do. Well, that has prophetic implications too. And this week, there they are. I think that's Jake Sullivan sitting there by Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, talking about reaffirming the United States' commitment to what? The two-state solution. This does not end well for people who promote this. This is kind of an interesting, from Al-Quds newspaper, Christmas tree on the Palestinian Khalifa on the wall. By the way, the wall's only really around parts of Bethlehem. It's not all over the place. It's mainly a fence. 125 countries are now backing a war crimes probe of Israel with regard to Operation Guardian of the Walls that happened last May. And then this editorial this morning in the Arab News. The author is the president of the International Institute for Iranian Studies, a doctor. And he says, storm clouds are gathering over Iran. Look at the image that he's put up there. The author is president of this organization. Whoops. And he says, Saudis see Iran as a real threat. Despite some reports to the contrary, talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia are not making progress. Actually, this is my commentary on what he says. That's not his. Much like the talks between Iran and everywhere else, there are multiple problems in Iran. There's economic, and this analyst goes through these. He says there are problems, but Iran is committed to doing this, and something needs to be done. So I think this has a lot of prophetic implications, and we can talk about Turkey and Russia and Ukraine and that type of thing. I think the Middle East is more important, though, in these discussions. So interesting times to be alive. It just all seems to be, well, so the answer to the question, will 2022 be 2022? I hope it's only 2020. I see a lot of things that are very concerning. And we'll continue to talk about them here. But, look, stay in the Word. We know that these things are coming, particularly the stuff that's happening in the church and this nonsense that Archbishop Welby was spewing in that article in the London Times a week ago today. It's interesting times. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for blessing us with living, allowing us to live in such interesting times, knowing that you have given us guidance in your word about what's coming. And you will give us understanding as we get closer and closer to these things wrapping up. But give us wisdom, give us ears to hear, eyes to see, and minds to understand what is going on in light of what you have prophesied. But also give us the ability and the heart to take that information and use it in evangelizing those around us as time seems to be growing increasingly short. Give us opportunities to share the gospel. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen.